Welcome to When Gen X Ruled the Multiplex, where I look at some films that shaped those of us born between 1965 and 1980. By 1982, when E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial was released, Steven Spielberg was already a popular and prolific director, known for films like Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and, of course, Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I've already looked at here. The screenplay for E.T. was written by Melissa Matheson, who had written the script for 1979's The Black Stallion. E.T. was the highest-grossing film of 1982. In fact, it was the highest-grossing film of all time until it was unseated in 1993 by Jurassic Park. It has since become an enduring pop culture phenomenon. In Southern California, a spherical alien spaceship lands in a wooded area. Seen only from a distance, small, brown, large-headed alien creatures, with hearts that occasionally radiate bright red from within their stubby bodies, gather samples of plant life. One of the aliens wanders away from the others to stare at the Los Angeles skyline. At just that moment, a bunch of cars and trucks pull up and surround the alien spaceship. The spaceship is forced to take off, leaving the distraught alien stranded on Earth. The alien will become known as E.T., the extraterrestrial of the title, though we don't yet get a good look at him. For about the first quarter of the film, we'll only see him in long shots and partial glimpses. Inside a suburban family home in the San Fernando Valley, teenaged Michael and his friends hang out and play D&D. The radio is blasting the punk anthem People Who Died by the Jim Carroll Band, which is a totally awesome song. We've also heard it prominently in the greatest trash film of the 80s, Tough Turf. But it seems like maybe the weirdest possible choice to pop up on the soundtrack of a heartwarming family adventure film. The kids send Michael's 10-year-old brother Elliot outside with a wad of cash to pay for their pizza delivery. Michael is played by Robert McNaughton, who also starred in a film adaptation of Robert Cormier's novel I Am the Cheese, but who otherwise largely retired from acting after this role. One of Michael's friends is played by C. Thomas Howell in his film debut. Howell's second screen appearance was his starring role in Francis Ford Coppola's The Outsiders, which I've already looked at here. Elliot is played by Henry Thomas, who has appeared in literally dozens of other films and television shows, often in fairly high-profile roles, but who will always be best known for this career-defining part. After picking up the pizza, Elliot hears strange noises coming from the gardening shed in the backyard. When he tosses a baseball into the shed, something tosses it back to him. Elliot runs into the house in a panic and tells his distracted mother Mary that something weird is in the backyard. Mary is played by Dee Wallace, who is kicking off a solid run of playing moms in 80s sci-fi and horror films, including Cujo and Critters. In the middle of the night, Elliot again hears noises in the backyard. He searches a field of corn growing in a neighboring lot. You don't often find corn growing in greater Los Angeles. Elliot and E.T. have their first brief face-to-face encounter, which causes them both to thoroughly wig out. In the morning, Elliot heads out in search of E.T., leaving a trail of Reese's Pieces. When Eminem passed up the chance for some primo product placement, Reese's Pieces stepped in. It paid off. Reese's Pieces became inextricably linked with this film, and product sales tripled within 2 weeks of E.T.'s release. This is still held up as one of the most commercially successful examples of product placement of all time. Over a strained family dinner, we meet Elliot's toddler sister Gertie, who is played by Drew Barrymore. Barrymore had auditioned for the role of Carol Ann in Poltergeist, which was written and produced by Spielberg, and which I've also already looked at here. And while that role went to Heather O'Rourke, Spielberg kept Barrymore in mind for this role, which turned her into a leading child star. She'd go on to star in Irreconcilable Differences, Cat's Eye, and Firestarter before her career derailed in the late 80s due to her troubled personal life. She has since rebounded nicely and has become a well-regarded actor and producer. The kids discuss their plans for Halloween, while Mary has a quiet breakdown over her still-fresh separation from her husband. Elliot camps out in the backyard. E.T. approaches and gives Elliot a pile of Reese's Pieces, and Elliot cajoles E.T. into the house. This is our first good look at E.T. in full. The very complicated E.T. effects were overseen by special effects artist Carlo Rambaldi. At various times, E.T. is either a mechanical or electrical puppet, or is portrayed by an actor wearing a rubber suit. Those actors included 12-year-old Matthew Merritt, who was born without legs and performed the role while walking on his hands, and two persons of short stature, Pat Billon and Tamara Detrow. E.T.'s hand motions were performed by a mime named Caprice Roth. His voice was mostly performed by a heavy smoker named Pat Welsh, though other actors, including Deborah Winger, also contributed sounds. Meanwhile, a faceless team of what we assume are government agents and/or scientists sweep the nearby woods, searching for the alien but finding only Reese's Pieces. With some exceptions, we will not see many faces of adult characters throughout the film. Spielberg deliberately shot the film from the lowered perspective of both Elliot and E.T., and thus adult faces are often cropped out of the frame. There's a deleted scene that can be found online in which Elliot talks to his school principal, whose face we never see but who is played by Harrison Ford, who of course had worked with Steven Spielberg before and who would go on to marry E.T. E.T.'s screenwriter, Melissa Matheson. Elliot fakes an illness to stay home from school. He discovers he and E.T. have developed an emotional bond. Whatever one feels, the other feels as well. When Michael and Gertie arrive home from school, Elliot introduces them to E.T., who is very kind and gentle. After some initial wigging out, the kids bond with E.T., who can't yet speak, but who can more or less follow their attempts at communicating. At school the next day, Elliot's science class dissects frogs. Elliot is 10, so he's probably in the 4th grade. I dissected frogs and fetal pigs in 7th grade, and every school district has their own rules, so while 4th grade seems maybe a little young for dissection, it's certainly possible. The part I find a little bit traumatizing about this, however, is that all these 10-year-olds have to murder their own frogs first before chopping them up. Our frogs arrived long dead and pickled in formaldehyde. Left alone at home, E.T. chugs a Coors, which is also some good product placement. Due to their emotional bond, young Elliot gets drunk right along with E.T. in his science classroom. He goes renegade and releases all the frogs, causing pandemonium. In a weird little moment, he also drunkenly kisses a classmate, who is played by a very young Erica Eleniak, who would go on to star in Baywatch. At home, E.T. dissects a popcorn popper and a blender and a speak and spell and an umbrella and various other toys and household appliances to create something that will allow him to make contact with his spaceship. Mary arrives home and fields a call from the school saying Elliot went on a drunken rampage in science class. Instead of throwing 5-year-old Gertie in the car before heading to the school, she leaves Gertie home alone while she heads off to the school to pick up her drunken, disorderly 10-year-old. I wouldn't necessarily give an A+ to Mary's parenting throughout the film, especially when she repeatedly fails to notice the alien creature living in her house and eating all her food, but she's got a lot on her mind, and anyway, the 80s were a very different time. My sister and I were discussing the other day how when we were toddlers in the late 70s and early 80s, our parents would sometimes get up early and go out to breakfast by themselves, leaving us to wake up and forage for ourselves in an empty house. So, Mary, there's no judgment here. Left alone with E.T., Gertie dresses him up in an assortment of Mary's clothes. E.T. pieces together his first sentence from words he's learned from Gertie and from the television. He points to the sky and tells the kids, E.T. phone home. This, of course, became one of the most famous slogans quoted on school playgrounds by all us young Gen Xers, right up there with May the Force be with you and Where's the Beef? The faceless team of government agents drives through the neighborhood, eavesdropping on conversations. They overhear Michael and Elliot talking about how E.T. has been looking progressively unhealthier the longer he stays on Earth. When Elliot cuts his finger on the blade of a bandsaw, E.T.'s finger glows and he heals Elliot with a touch. Halloween rolls around and the kids dress up in their costumes, smuggling E.T. out of the house by disguising him as a ghost. E.T. spots a trick-or-treater dressed as Yoda and appears to recognize him. This cute throwaway joke had a callback in 1999's The Phantom Menace, in which we discover that E.T.'s alien race does indeed exist in the Star Wars universe. Elliot and E.T. head into the woods. E.T. is somehow able to levitate Elliot's bike, so they soar among the trees. E.T. uses his handmade contraption to send a signal into the night sky. Elliot falls asleep while waiting for a response, and when he wakes up the next morning, E.T. is missing. Elliot returns home distraught and very sick. Michael heads out on his bike and spots a dying E.T. lying in a ravine. He brings him back to the house, and a horrified Mary finally realizes her kids have been harboring an alien fugitive. Their home is invaded on all sides by faceless government agents in spacesuits and hazmat suits. Hordes of government workers and cops and scientists take over the house, swaddling it in plastic and creating a system of tunnels leading into a makeshift laboratory. Chief among the government agents is a man listed in the credits as Keyes, though he's never identified by name in the film. Keyes is played by Peter Coyote, whom we have seen in The Legend of Billie Jean. E.T. is treated by a team of doctors, but he's clearly dying, while Elliot is also deathly ill due to their emotional bond. Despite the best efforts of the doctors to save him, E.T. dies, while a heartbroken Elliot returns to good health. Keyes gives Elliot a chance to say goodbye to E.T.'s lifeless body. An utterly destroyed Elliot tells E.T. he loves him. E.T.'s heart begins glowing inside his chest, and he returns to life. He tells Elliot his ship received their signal and is returning to pick him up. Elliot and Michael manage to swipe E.T. out from under the noses of the government agents. They team up with their school friends, and with E.T. riding in the basket of Elliot's bike, they head to the woods to rendezvous with a spaceship. As the police close in, E.T. makes all their bikes levitate, and they soar into the air, leaving the police far behind. The kids reach the woods, and the alien spaceship lands. Elliot and E.T. part in tears before the spaceship takes to the skies. This is a really beautiful film. Full disclosure, I was 9 when E.T. was released, and at that age, pretty much every film I saw became my new favorite film. And yet E.T. was one of the few films I actively disliked. I wasn't too much of a wimp with scary films, even at that age. Poltergeist, which was released in theaters 1 week before E.T., was one of my favorites, and in the abstract, Poltergeist is a much scarier film, but something about E.T. really messed me up. It wasn't E.T. himself, who looks kind of spooky, yet is clearly very sweet and lovable. I found parts of the film terrifying, like seeing E.T. lying near death in the ravine, or seeing the faceless government agents in hazmat suits invading the house by force. The film is often emotionally raw. Henry Thomas gives a dynamic performance as young Elliot, who spends much of the film in a state of emotional devastation. Even though there's eventually a happy, if bittersweet ending, Elliot goes through emotional hell before he gets there. And as a kid roughly Elliot's age, I found this all pretty depressing. But all those elements I found so unsettling as a kid are, of course, the elements that make this such an excellent and effective film. It is meticulously made. Spielberg had a very clear idea of what he wanted, and he surrounded himself with people who were extraordinarily good at their jobs. The script is filled with small moments that help the characters feel real. Mary tries her best to keep herself together for her kids, but when she's alone by herself on Halloween, dressed up like a sexy cat to hand out treats, the facade collapses, and we see she's lonely and miserable. Big brother Michael is filled with a lot of sarcastic bravado, but when E.T. dies, he reverts back to a small child hiding in a closet surrounded by stuffed animals. Spielberg and the film's casting directors found a phenomenal trio of young actors in Robert McNaughton, Drew Barrymore, and Henry Thomas, all of whom act their socks off. Thomas remains the gold standard for child stars for his solemn and heartfelt performance as Elliot. E.T. became a cultural juggernaut, staying in theaters for over a year. Spielberg was not a fan of home video releases, so it took until 1988 before E.T. was released on VHS, and the tapes were only sold for about 6 months before being pulled off the market to make sure the film retained most of its theatrical value. This seems like a foreign concept in our current era, where films are often released nearly simultaneously in theaters and on digital media. The E.T. video release was a huge deal, and it necessitated a great many previously unknown anti-piracy measures. These included extra security measures whenever the tapes were being stored or transported, special holographic stickers on the tapes to prove authenticity, and an embedded copy protection signal, so if you tried to dub it off onto another tape, you'd end up with nothing but a black screen. It seems like a lot of fuss, but E.T. has always been special. Unique among major blockbusters, it's never had a sequel, nor has it been rebooted. The closest we've come is a Comcast commercial from 2020, in which an adult Elliot, still played by Henry Thomas, reunites with his long-lost best friend and introduces him to the internet. And you know, it's a dumb commercial meant to sell a product, and yet it still tugs on the heartstrings. Because even after 40 years, the galaxy-bridging bond between a lonely little kid and his even lonelier alien friend still seems almost unbearably poignant. Next time we're going to do the right thing when I look at Spike Lee's 1989 classic. Thank you for joining me today. Stay safe and well, and I hope to see you then.